Hi, I'm Olivia, the woman my husband spent years tearing down. The day I lost my job, he laughed in my face, called me useless, said he'd always known I'd fail. He thought I had nothing left. But I never told him about the patent I'd sold for $97 million. So when he pushed for a divorce to upgrade, I smiled, signed, and stayed quiet. Months later, when he finally learned the truth, that smirk vanished in an instant. The autumn wind carried that crisp bite through downtown Portland, the kind that makes you reach for your coat without thinking. From our kitchen window in the Pearl District, I watched the last streaks of daylight fade behind the glass towers. Our condo was warm enough, but there was a chill I couldn't shake, maybe from the failing weather seal on the balcony door, or maybe from the way my husband Blake had been looking at me since I got home. It had been a Tuesday ordinary in every way, until 3:17 p.m. when my supervisor at Intel asked me to step into his office for a quick chat. I knew before I sat down that it wasn't just talk. I'd been with the company for 9 years, senior research and development, multiple patents under my belt, leading a team that brought in millions. Yet that day, all I heard was restructuring and budget realignment. My position was no longer sustainable. I drove home through the Columbia River Gorge in silence, thinking maybe Blake would at least pretend to care. By 6 o'clock, our living room smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted chicken, not because he'd cooked. He'd ordered from that upscale place on Northwest 23rd. Some of the guys are coming over, he'd said when I walked in. Figured we could all catch up. By catch up, he meant he could hold court and remind everyone how well his investment firm was doing. He was pouring Woodford Reserve for himself and his two buddies, Cameron and Josh, when I came in from hanging up my coat. "Hey honey," Blake said, flashing that smile that never reached his eyes. "Everyone, meet my unemployed wife." He laughed like it was the punchline of the year. Cameron shifted uncomfortably. Josh avoided my eyes completely. I managed a polite smile. "Good evening, gentlemen." "Yeah," Blake continued, settling back in his leather chair like a king on his throne. "She finally proved me right. Always said the tech world was too cutthroat for her. Guess I was spot on." His mother, Patricia, had been perched at the far end of our granite dining table, nursing a glass of Kendall Jackson Chardonnay. She'd been visiting from Scottsdale for a week, helping out, though her version of helping usually meant pointing out everything I wasn't doing right. "Well," Patricia said, swirling her wine with practiced elegance, "some women just aren't built for real responsibility. That's not necessarily bad, it just means you're better suited for other pursuits." I didn't ask what other pursuits meant. I already knew. Blake smirked, his friends now comfortable enough to join the pile-on. "Don't worry, babe," he said with mock sweetness. "I'll handle the big decisions from now on. You can, I don't know, take up yoga or join a book club." I kept my expression neutral, though inside every word hit like a small, sharp stone. While Blake launched into some story about a merger he was orchestrating, I slid my hand into my lap, tilted my phone slightly, and opened my banking app. The number on the screen was steady, unblinking, $97,438,221. That patent sale from months ago had cleared without anyone in this house knowing. Not Blake, not Patricia, no one. I looked back up. He was still talking, gesturing with his glass for emphasis. His friends nodded along like bobblehead dolls. I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I just absorbed the scene, the polished marble countertop, the clink of ice and crystal, the faint aroma of food I hadn't been asked to serve. I felt the familiar weight of his arrogance, but this time it didn't crush me. It centered me. Patricia rose to check on dessert, brushing past me with that cloud of Chanel No. 5 superiority. Blake was explaining to Josh how freeing it was for me to be out of the rat race. I reached for my water glass, sipped slowly, and let my mind drift, not to the loss of a job, but to the quiet, steady power of watching a plan form. By the time plates were cleared and jackets were being pulled on, I'd already decided I wouldn't speak of the account, wouldn't hint at the deals I'd been quietly working on. I'd let him bask in this performance. Let him believe the story he'd spun tonight. When the last guest left, Blake patted my shoulder like he was comforting a lost child. "We'll get through this, babe," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of false charity only a man who thinks he's won can manage. I smiled up at him. "I'm sure we will." And in that moment, I knew exactly when I'd let him discover he'd lost everything. 2 weeks later, I sat at our kitchen island, the soft hum of the espresso machine filling the morning silence. Dawn light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting golden lines across the Brazilian hardwood floors. I'd been up since sunrise, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I wanted every detail of this day burned into my memory. I heard the front door open and close. Blake's footsteps carried that same confident weight I'd known for years, the sound of a man who believed every room belonged to him before he stepped inside. A moment later, he walked in with his lawyer, both in tailored suits as if they'd been preparing for some kind of victory parade. "Morning," he said, dropping into the bar stool across from me without invitation. His attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Lawrence Hartwell from one of Portland's white shoe firms, set down his leather briefcase and pulled out a neat stack of papers. He slid them toward me with a calculated smile. "We've discussed what's equitable," Blake began, his voice low and deliberate. "Given how different our trajectories are, this divorce is really a kindness. You should find someone who actually needs a supportive partner." Lawrence jumped in smoothly. "This settlement offers you clarity. No drawn-out proceedings, no unnecessary drama. You'll receive your personal belongings, a modest settlement to help you transition, and a clean slate for both parties." I let my eyes scan the pages. Minimal alimony, no share of marital assets, no mention of the years I'd supported him through his failed startup attempts or the nights I'd stayed up balancing our books while he slept like the world owed him rest. I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. I simply reached for the Mont Blanc pen Blake had given me for our 3rd anniversary, back when he still pretended my achievements mattered. Their eyes met briefly, a flicker of smug satisfaction passing between them. They thought my silence was surrender, my signature an act of desperation. While I signed, I thought about my father's voice, the one I hadn't heard in over a decade. He used to say, "If someone's digging their own grave, don't take away the shovel. Just make sure they dig it deep enough." I slid the signed papers back across the marble surface. Lawrence gathered them up like he'd just captured the winning lottery ticket. Blake leaned back, that self-satisfied grin spreading across his face like warm butter. "You're making the smart choice," he said. "For both of us." I met his eyes briefly, then looked away as though the words had stung more than I wanted to admit. Inside though, my mind was already cataloging every business account password, every property deed, every thread of financial connection he'd forgotten I still controlled. I didn't need to fight now. I just needed to ensure all the pieces were positioned correctly. "I'll start packing today," I said quietly. "That's for the best," Lawrence agreed, already standing and packing his briefcase. What neither of them knew was that buried deep in the property deed for this very condo was a clause Blake had never bothered reading, one that meant he couldn't sell or refinance the place without my written consent. He thought I was walking away empty-handed. In reality, I was walking away holding the key to a door he'd eventually need opened. After they left, the condo felt different, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets. I moved through our home methodically, opening drawers, sliding hangers from the walk-in closet, folding each piece of clothing with deliberate care. But with each item I placed into a box, I tucked in something else. Bank statements, photocopies of contracts, receipts for purchases he'd assumed I'd forgotten about. By the time the sun began its descent behind the West Hills, the hallway was lined with neat stacks. From the outside, they looked like the belongings of a woman starting over. But I knew the truth. These boxes were more than fabric and photographs. They were evidence. They were ammunition. As I sealed the last box with packing tape, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face was calm, almost peaceful. No one looking at me would guess what I was holding back or what I was planning. I took one final walk through the kitchen, running my fingers along the marble countertop where the morning had begun. It felt like another lifetime already. Tomorrow the condo would be quieter without me here. But the echo of today's silence, the one they'd mistaken for defeat, would follow them much longer than they could possibly imagine. But first, there was something I needed Blake to understand about the foundation his new life was built on. I loaded my things in silence, but every box I carried wasn't just clothes and books. It was evidence. I set the last box in my car trunk, closed it quietly, and stood there for a moment under the building's entrance light. My breath curled in the cool October air, but my mind was already somewhere else. For months back, in a cramped laboratory that smelled faintly of solder and coffee. It had been a Tuesday well past 9 p.m. The small research facility I rented in Beaverton wasn't much to look at, just 2 long workbenches, a dented filing cabinet, and shelves sagging under the weight of prototypes and blueprints. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting that pale glow that made the world outside feel 1,000 miles away. I was hunched over the main workbench, my hands stained with graphite, the faint scent of machine oil clinging to my sleeves. The prototype sat before me, a sleek device no bigger than a paperback novel. After months of 18-hour days, wires and circuitry were finally coming together. I remember pressing that final component into place. Hearing the satisfying click that meant everything had locked perfectly. It was finished. Not perfect, but functional, innovative, and entirely mine. The lab door creaked, and in stepped Walter, my mentor, 62, semi-retired, the kind of man who'd rather fix something than replace it. He carried 2 steaming cups of Stumptown coffee, setting one beside me without a word. "You look like you've been through a battlefield," he said, studying the scattered notes and circuit boards. "Feels like it," I admitted, straightening up and rubbing my lower back. "But Walter, it actually works. I think it really works." He picked up the device, turning it over in his weathered hands with the reverence of someone who understood what months of sleepless nights looked like. "You realize what this means, right?" I did. It meant independence. Insurance against any storm, personal or professional. But I also knew that if Blake caught even a whisper of it, it would never truly be mine for long. That's why, a week earlier, I'd already contacted my patent attorney, Linda Morrison. Linda was a precise woman in her 50s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, the kind who didn't waste words or time. We'd met at her downtown office overlooking the Willamette River, and she'd agreed to every precaution I'd requested. File under my maiden name, Olivia Chen. Use the lab's address as the primary contact. Leave no legal breadcrumb that could lead back to Blake or our marriage. Make it completely untraceable to our joint assets. The hum of my phone pulled me from the memory. Linda's name lit up the screen. "Ready for some excellent news?" she asked the moment I answered. "I could definitely use some." The patent was approved this morning, and the sale finalized an hour ago. Biotech Solutions out of Seattle. Total, $97 million. I gripped the edge of the workbench, my knees suddenly feeling light. "Million," I whispered, as if saying it too loudly might shatter the spell. "Already secured in an irrevocable trust," she continued, her tone steady and professional. "Wire transfers are complete, and you're fully protected. But remember, there's a strict confidentiality clause. If anyone connected to you tries to claim a share, and we can prove they learned about it improperly, they forfeit any potential claim, including him." Walter had been listening, his brow furrowing thoughtfully. When I hung up, he leaned against the bench, crossing his arms. "You've just built yourself a life raft in a hurricane," he said quietly. "Now don't tell anyone about it, especially not him. Some storms are worth watching from the eye." I nodded, though part of me wanted to shout my success to the world. Instead, I let the quiet satisfaction settle deep in my bones. I'd done this. No inheritance, no handouts, no help from Blake's connections. Just my own determination and a sketch that had become something revolutionary. That night, after Walter left, I stayed in the lab longer than necessary. I carefully labeled the prototype, tucked the design files into a fireproof folder, and slid them into the bottom drawer of the cabinet. My hands lingered there for a second before I locked it and dropped the key into my pocket. The city outside was still alive when I stepped into the parking lot, but I felt separate from it all, like I was carrying a secret the rest of the world couldn't see. I drove home with the patent papers on the passenger seat, streetlights flashing across them in brief golden stripes. By the time I reached our condo building, the weight of what I'd accomplished settled over me, not as a burden, but as armor. Whatever storms were coming, I wouldn't be walking into them defenseless. That night, I locked the patent papers in our home safe, never imagining how soon I'd need them. But Blake's arrogance was about to give me the perfect opportunity to use that armor. By the next afternoon, Portland's October air had that damp warmth the Pacific Northwest gets before a storm rolls in from the coast. I'd left my new apartment early enough to avoid traffic, parking a block away from the restaurant Blake had chosen, one of those trendy spots in the Alberta Arts District with exposed brick walls, Edison bulb fixtures, and baristas who treat coffee like performance art. He was already there when I walked in, claiming a corner table with perfect posture and a charcoal suit pressed to military precision. And beside him, leaning back with one manicured hand wrapped around an oat milk courtidoux, was the woman I'd been seeing in the background of his social media posts lately. I took my time crossing the room, letting him stand just long enough to appear polite, but not enough to actually pull out my chair. "Thanks for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I thought it would be good to handle this transition like mature adults. His voice carried that artificial sincerity I'd heard him use before client meetings, right before he'd slide a financial knife between someone's ribs. "This is Kelsey," he added, motioning toward her with a smile that was just shy of triumphant. "She's been helping me see life from a fresher perspective. An upgrade, you could say." Kelsey gave me that look I'd seen countless times on women who think they've won the lottery. She was stunning, I'll give her that, perfect honey blonde highlights, a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's rent, and a smile that didn't quite reach her expertly lined eyes. I nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. "Nice to meet you, Kelsey." The server approached, a young woman with kind eyes and intricate tattoo sleeves, setting down a lavender honey latte without my having to ask. Muscle memory from months of working in this neighborhood. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, letting the aromatic steam curl toward my face. "You know," Blake continued, clearly enjoying his moment, "once the divorce is finalized, I'm not planning to waste any time. I feel liberated, like I can finally level up without being held back by, well, you understand." He was watching me for a reaction. I gave him nothing, just sipped my latte thoughtfully. Kelsey tilted her head, eyes bright with the thrill of delivering what she thought was a devastating blow. "It must be challenging, losing your career and your marriage in the same year. But I'm sure that alimony check will keep you comfortable for a while." I met her gaze, still perfectly calm. "I'm confident I'll manage just fine." What they didn't know was that the trust was buried so deep in legal protection, they couldn't find it with a team of forensic accountants. The payout for my patent sale wasn't even filed under my married name. Every asset I truly cared about was sealed tighter than Fort Knox. While they chatted, him about a golf trip to Pebble Beach he was planning, her about some charity auction at the Portland Art Museum, I let my mind wander to the numbers, the accounts, the quiet empire I'd built. They thought they were delivering a crushing blow. I was already standing on higher ground than they could imagine. The conversation drifted, but every so often I'd catch Blake glancing at me like my stillness unnerved him. Anger would have been easier for him to handle. Tears even better. But this steady, almost amused quiet wasn't in the script he'd written for today. Then Kelsey, in her eagerness to prove she belonged in his new life, let something slip. "Once the house is ours, we'll finally have the space we deserve for entertaining," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Blake's already got the financing figured out." My eyes stayed on her, but inside I felt that familiar click, like a puzzle piece sliding into place. A house financed against what he assumed were solely his assets he believed I had no way to touch. I stood after finishing my latte, setting a generous tip under the saucer. "Enjoy your lunch," I said lightly. As I walked toward the door, I felt their eyes following me. Blake thought I was leaving broken and powerless, stripped of everything that mattered. But the truth was, I'd already secured everything that truly counted, long before he'd invited me to this little performance. He thought I was walking away with nothing. The reality was, I'd already walked away with everything, and tomorrow, he was going to start learning exactly what that meant. The next morning, Portland's sky was that perfect shade of pale blue you only get in early fall, when the air still holds a whisper of summer but the light makes the city's glass towers look almost ethereal. I parked several blocks from the Multnomah County Courthouse, giving myself time to walk through downtown. Each step on the brick sidewalks felt measured, deliberate, like I was exactly where I was meant to be at precisely the right moment. Inside, the courthouse's tall glass doors opened with surprising ease, and the atmosphere shifted from the muted hum of street traffic to the echo of heels on polished marble. A clerk at the information desk nodded politely, directing me toward the family court division on the 3rd floor. I didn't need the directions. I'd been here before for other people's cases, just never for something this personal. My attorney, Helen Rodriguez, was already waiting outside the courtroom. She looked relaxed, coffee in hand, her navy suit as crisp as if it had materialized from thin air. "Morning, Olivia," she said softly, her voice carrying that steady confidence that always made me feel like she'd seen every possible courtroom trick. Across the marble hallway, Blake stood with his lawyer, a younger man with perfectly styled hair and a grin that suggested he thought this case was already won. Blake's arms were crossed, his Armani tie knotted with mathematical precision, and there was a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He glanced at me the way someone might look at a piece of furniture they're about to donate, briefly and without any emotional attachment. We were called in, and the proceedings began almost immediately. Judge Patricia Williams read through our settlement agreement point by point, her voice clear and professional. I didn't interrupt, didn't ask for revisions, didn't challenge a single clause. I simply nodded each time my name was mentioned, signing wherever Helen slid the papers in front of me. Blake's attorney kept stealing glances at me, clearly waiting for me to fight over some provision or demand more alimony, but I let every term stand exactly as written. I even declined spousal support entirely. You could practically see the satisfaction blooming on Blake's face. His shoulders relaxed, his jaw unclenched. To him, this wasn't just winning, this was confirmation of every story he'd told himself about how easily I could be replaced. Looks like she just wants out, his lawyer murmured, but loud enough for me to hear. Blake gave a low chuckle in response. Helen remained completely unreadable, sliding the signed settlement toward the clerk without even a flicker of concern. She knew what they didn't. My entire life wasn't balanced on this agreement. When the final signature was in place, Judge Williams nodded, paperwork was shuffled, and just like that, 7 years of marriage dissolved in less than 20 minutes. We rose, the scrape of chairs filling the silence. At the courtroom door, Blake leaned slightly toward me. "Don't spend it all in one place," he said quietly, his words dripping with mock sympathy. Kelsey wasn't there, but I could picture her wearing that same victorious smile she'd had at the restaurant. I didn't break stride. Outside the courtroom, sunlight streamed across the courthouse's wide marble steps, so bright it made me squint. Helen touched my arm gently. "You're free to move forward," she said simply. Then she stepped aside as a court clerk approached me, an unassuming man with a manila envelope in his weathered hands. "This was delivered for you this morning, Ms. Chen," he said. His tone was neutral, but his eyes lingered for just a moment before he moved on to his next task. I waited until I reached the bottom of the courthouse steps to open it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, confirmation of funds deposited into the trust account. The patent sale had cleared completely. The figure printed there was almost surreal, $97,438,221. Commas and zeros lined up like soldiers, proof of everything I'd built long before Blake decided I was dead weight he needed to cut loose. I folded the paper carefully, tucking it into my purse with the same care you'd give a letter you plan to keep forever. By the time Blake sat down to his victory dinner that evening, probably toasting his freedom with the same overconfidence he'd worn into court, my bank balance had more commas than he could count in his wildest dreams. He thought I was leaving with nothing. The truth was, I'd already left with more wealth than he could accumulate in 3 lifetimes. But that wasn't the kind of thing you broadcast. Not yet, anyway. There were still a few more moves to make before I revealed my hand completely. And tomorrow was going to be very interesting indeed. I'd moved into a modest apartment in southeast Portland's Hawthorne district, the kind of place where nobody looked twice at you coming or going. Hardwood floors, white walls, basic furniture from West Elm, and a single piece of art, a small print I'd bought at the Saturday market. No statement pieces, no luxury touches. It was exactly what I wanted, plain enough to make people think I was scraping by after the divorce. The evenings were peaceful. I'd sit by the window with a cup of chamomile tea from my favorite local shop, watching the bustle of Hawthorne Boulevard blend into background noise. My best friend, Natalie, called most nights. She was the only person who knew the real number in my accounts. "You're driving me absolutely crazy," she said one Thursday evening, her voice carrying that familiar exasperation. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to keep my mouth shut when people act like you're practically homeless?" "That's exactly the point, Nat," I told her, curling up in my single armchair. "Let them think I'm broke. It's much safer this way." She sighed like we'd had this argument a dozen times, which we had. "One day you're going to tell me you waited too long to act, and I'm going to say, I told you so." But I wasn't in any hurry. Every week brought new intelligence about Blake and his so-called upgrade. People tagged me in photos accidentally, or sent screenshots from mutual friends. There he was, grinning at some rooftop bar in the South Waterfront, his arm around Kelsey while champagne flowed freely. Next, a rental Tesla for a weekend in wine country. Then photos from a luxury ski lodge in Aspen, complete with designer gear and bottle service selfies. None of it bothered me, not the way they probably hoped it would. All I saw was a pattern emerging, money flowing out faster than it was coming in, fueled by Kelsey's appetite for the kind of lifestyle that burns through bank accounts like wildfire. In the afternoons, I'd meet with my financial advisor, Scott Morrison, at his downtown office in the U.S. Bancorp Tower. We kept our meetings discreet, late appointments or coffee shops on the east side where Blake's crowd never ventured. We discussed investments, trusts, and strategic acquisitions. Every dollar had a purpose, every move was calculated. You could be living in a penthouse at the Cosmopolitan tomorrow if you wanted, he said during one of our evening sessions. Hell, you could buy the whole building. I could, I agreed, sipping my coffee. But that would completely ruin the story they're telling themselves right now. And I want them to believe that story just a little while longer. That belief was proving incredibly useful. It made people careless around me, dropping information they'd never share if they knew my real situation. A few weeks later, I ran into Caroline Martinez, a woman I'd known through various tech industry events. She wasn't close to me, but she was one of those people who collected gossip like some people collect vintage wine. We bumped into each other in the produce section at New Seasons, chatting casually among the organic kale and locally grown apples. Halfway through our conversation, she leaned in closer, lowering her voice like she was sharing state secrets. I saw your ex-husband last week at that new steakhouse downtown, she said, eyes wide with the thrill of delivering juicy news. He was going on about how amazing his life is now, but he mentioned something weird. Apparently, he's been using some business credit accounts that you two had together. I thought that was strange since you're divorced now. I kept my expression completely neutral, as if this was just mildly interesting information. Oh, I assumed those were closed already. She shrugged, already losing interest. Maybe he just hasn't gotten around to it yet. Then she wandered off toward the bakery section, leaving me standing there between the heirloom tomatoes and organic carrots. I didn't need to verify what Caroline had told me. I already knew she was absolutely right. Those credit lines were still active, still showing me as a guarantor, and I had the legal authority to freeze them whenever I chose. I finished my shopping in a state of crystalline clarity, each step deliberate and purposeful. If Blake wanted to treat borrowed money like his personal piggy bank, he'd made himself completely vulnerable. Back at my apartment, I set the groceries down, poured a glass of Oregon Pinot Grigio, and stepped onto my small balcony. The city lights of Portland twinkled below like stars, and I could smell the faint aroma of food carts drifting up from the street. If he wanted to play financial games with my name still attached, I decided it was time to call in those debts. The reckoning was about to begin. I didn't waste a single moment. The very next morning, I called Scott's office and asked if he could see me immediately. His voice was steady as always, but I caught that slight pause he gets when he knows I'm about to make a significant move. By 11 a.m., I was in his office in downtown Portland's financial district, the kind of space where everything gleams, polished mahogany, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, and the faint scent of leather from Italian chairs. Scott closed the door the moment I stepped inside, setting his phone face down on the desk. "You've made your decision?" he asked, leaning back just enough to study my expression. "Yes," I said, settling into the chair across from him. "I want to confirm every joint credit line Blake has accessed since our separation, then freeze them all. Today. And I want to call in the full balances immediately." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You understand this will hit him like a financial tsunami?" "That's exactly the point." Scott turned to his computer, fingers flying across the keyboard. Within minutes, a comprehensive list appeared on his screen. There they were, 3 major accounts, all still showing me as the primary guarantor. One of them had a balance that made my stomach tighten, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of Blake's spending. "He's been living like the money will never run out," Scott said quietly, scrolling through the charges. "International travel, luxury restaurants, high-end boutique purchases, and this is just what I can see at first glance." "Freeze every single one," I told him, "and prepare whatever paperwork is needed to demand immediate full payment." He nodded, pulling a stack of legal forms from his filing cabinet. I signed each page without hesitation, my pen moving steadily across the documents. Every signature felt like closing a door Blake had assumed would stay open forever. When it was finished, Scott handed me a thick folder containing all the documentation. "Take this directly to the bank. They'll process everything faster if you handle it in person," The afternoon air outside carried hints of the approaching Pacific storm system. I walked the 4 blocks to the Wells Fargo corporate branch, my heels clicking rhythmically against the sidewalk, the legal folder tucked securely under my arm. Inside the bank, the lobby was cool and hushed. The branch manager, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver cufflinks, greeted me with practiced professionalism, until he saw exactly what I'd brought him. He flipped through the pages methodically, his expression growing more serious with each document. "You understand," he said slowly, "once I process these forms, the accounts will be completely frozen. No additional charges will be permitted, and the repayment demand will be substantial." I met his gaze directly. "I understand perfectly." He hesitated for just a moment before continuing. "Ma'am, the total amount owed across these accounts is quite significant. Full payment will be required within 5 business days." "Then I suppose someone's about to have a very educational week," I said, my voice calm as still water. He slid the documents into a secure envelope and called for assistance from the back office. A flurry of quiet activity followed, staff members disappearing into side offices, phone calls being made, computer systems being updated. By the time I stood to leave, I could see the first ripples of what was about to become a financial tidal wave. The autumn sunlight outside seemed sharper now, reflecting off the glass towers of downtown Portland. I'd barely made it halfway down the block when my phone buzzed with Blake's name on the screen. I didn't answer. 2 seconds later, a text appeared, "What the hell did you just do?" I stopped walking, letting the crowd flow around me on the busy sidewalk. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I didn't respond. The fact that he'd felt the impact this quickly meant the freeze was already in effect. And this was still just the opening move. I slipped my phone back into my purse and continued walking, the corners of my mouth curving into the smallest smile. He hadn't even discovered the real surprise yet, and already he was panicking. Within hours, Blake was begging for a meeting. I knew he'd want somewhere public. Men like him always do when they think they can control the narrative and maintain appearances. That's why I chose the exact same restaurant where, months earlier, he'd leaned back in his chair and dismissed me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. This time, I arrived first. The morning light poured through the wide windows, catching the steam rising from coffee cups and the glint of silverware. I requested a table in the center of the dining room, where anyone entering would see me immediately. I set my purse on the chair beside me, folded my hands on the reclaimed wood table, and waited. The server approached, the same young woman who'd served us before, recognition flickering in her kind eyes. "The usual lavender honey latte?" she asked softly. "Perfect. Thank you." 10 minutes later, Blake burst through the entrance. I saw him before he spotted me, pacing on the sidewalk outside, running his hands through his hair. When he finally walked in, his usually immaculate suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He spotted me and marched over without preamble. "You need to reverse what you did," he said the moment he reached the table, his voice sharp and demanding. "Immediately." I gestured calmly to the empty chair across from me. "Please sit down. Let's discuss this like adults." He sat, but his hands were already clenched into fists on the table. "The credit lines, you froze them. Do you have any idea what you've done? You're strangling me financially. I can't access funds, can't make payments. This isn't just petty revenge, it's perfectly legal," I interrupted gently. "And it's exactly what any responsible person would do when they discover their ex-husband is burning through credit accounts that still carry their name as guarantor." His jaw tightened visibly. "You don't understand the situation." "Oh, I understand completely," I said, keeping my tone even. "Private jets to Napa Valley, designer shopping sprees, that weekend at the St. Regis in Aspen, all while Kelsey has been encouraging you to live your best life. Except it's not your money, Blake. It's credit backed by my name." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "She has nothing to do with this." "Of course she does," I said, leaning forward just enough for my voice to drop. "She's been right beside you for every expensive decision. Don't insult my intelligence." The server returned with my latte, setting it down with a polite smile. Blake ordered nothing. When she left, I stirred my drink slowly, letting the silence work on him. "You wanted this divorce, Blake," I reminded him. "You wanted to be free, remember? Well, this is what real freedom looks like. I'm not your financial safety net anymore. His voice dropped lower, more controlled. Listen, if you don't reverse this immediately, I'll go public. I'll tell everyone that You'll tell lies, I finished for him, still perfectly calm. And you should absolutely try that approach. Because when you do, I'll release every financial record I've kept, every transfer receipt, every documentation of your spending patterns. I'm sure both the IRS and your investment firm's compliance department would find them fascinating reading. His face went pale for just a second before he looked away. He opened his mouth to fire back, and that's when the restaurant door opened. Kelsey walked in, clearly not expecting to see us sitting together. She froze halfway to the counter, her eyes darting between Blake and me with obvious surprise. "Good morning, Kelsey," I said, my voice warm but with an unmistakable edge. "What perfect timing." Her cheeks flushed. "You two are meeting?" "Oh yes," I said, resting my hands lightly on the table. "We have quite a bit to discuss, including some things that affect you directly." Kelsey shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Blake as if seeking permission to stay or leave. He looked between us, clearly out of his depth. I let the moment stretch until the air between us felt charged with tension. Then I leaned forward just enough to ensure they were both focused entirely on me. "There's something I kept to myself during our marriage," I said slowly. "Something I think you both deserve to know now." My fingers slipped into my purse and found the thick manila envelope. I placed it on the table with quiet precision, no drama, no flourish, just enough weight that they both noticed immediately. "That," I said, tapping the envelope once, "is a notarized summary of my patent sale." Blake's brow furrowed. "Patent?" Kelsey's gaze flickered between the envelope and my face, like she was trying to read the ending before I finished the story. "Yes," I said evenly. "The biomedical device I developed in my private laboratory. The one I sold 4 months ago for $97 million. I let that number hang in the air like smoke. The conversations at nearby tables seemed to fade into white noise. Blake's lips parted, but no sound came out. Kelsey looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. "And here's the part you'll both love," I continued, my voice still perfectly calm. "Because the patent was created and sold before our marriage using my maiden name, it's not marital property. By law, Blake, you have no claim to it. Not a single penny." The color drained completely from his face. "You're lying." "You're welcome to verify that with your attorney," I replied, sliding the envelope an inch closer to him. "It's all documented there. Patent applications, approval dates, sale contracts, wire transfer confirmations. You'll notice that my name, my maiden name, is the only signature on every single page." Kelsey's hands tightened around her designer purse strap. "Wait," she said slowly. "So you've been sitting on this fortune the entire time?" I nodded. "And while we're being completely honest, the credit freeze was just my opening move. By the end of this week, every account tied to my name will be reviewed for unpaid debts. That includes every overdraft fee, every late payment, every luxury expense you both thought no one would notice." Blake leaned forward, grasping for anger but landing somewhere closer to desperation. "You can't just." "I already have," I said simply. Kelsey's eyes darted to Blake, panic beginning to set in. "Hold on. If everything's frozen and he owes money." She cut herself off, but I could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was realizing exactly what kind of financial quicksand she'd walked into. I pushed my chair back slowly, the scrape of wood against tile sounding louder than it should have. Standing, I smoothed my jacket and looked down at both of them. "Thank you," I said, my voice level and final, "for the closure. I genuinely wish you both the very best of luck." Neither of them responded. I left the envelope exactly where it was and walked toward the exit without looking back. The morning air outside felt different, lighter somehow. I took my time walking the 2 blocks to where I'd parked, the crisp October breeze carrying the scent of coffee from nearby shops and the distant sound of Max trains. Each step put more distance between me and years of being underestimated, diminished, and treated like a convenience. By the time I reached my car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete freedom. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. My phone buzzed with a banking notification: trust account balance, $97,438,221. The timing made me laugh out loud. As I pulled away from the curb, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of Blake and Kelsey still sitting at that table, the envelope between them like evidence of a crime they'd committed against themselves. He'd called me useless the day I lost my job, smirking like he'd finally proven his point. What he never knew was that I'd already built something he couldn't tear down, earned something he couldn't take away, and secured a future he couldn't even imagine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. Sometimes it's just letting people discover exactly who they really are when they think no one's watching. And sometimes, it's letting them find out what you're really worth when they've already thrown you away.